Not completely urban, not yet rural. The suburbs are a comfortable in-between place where many people spend time growing up, making memories, and living life. But despite not being terribly close to dense wilderness and the unknown, the suburbs might still have some disturbing creatures lurking about, things that cause a local curfew and hushed whispers among the adults at night. Enjoy these allegedly true, scary stories about monsters seen in the suburbs. If you have a scary true story that took place on a Native American reservation, or you've seen an unexplained and creepy creature in Sweden, send me your story at darkstories.org. Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe to our other shows on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore and Redwood Bureau, for more terrifying entertainment. Now, let's begin. Werewolf sightings around the suburbs of Denver. From HeyItsEli 100. These are going to be short, but they're interesting, as these make 2 and 3 sightings in or around the greater Denver metro area. Number 1. A young girl was up late one night, looking out the second-story window of her suburban home in the Parker area, where it's semi-rural, but there are still Covenant communities drawing power from the grid. She witnessed a werewolf-like creature step out into the streetlight. She described it as the classic werewolf, with strong, rippling muscles, short, dark hair, backwards legs, and human-like hands. She said the head looked like a big wolf, with glowing amber eyes. She saw it look right up at her. It wasn't menacing, but it was very aware of her, even from a distance. It was so still she had to blink her eyes. The only motion was a slight ruffling of its fur in the breeze. I guess at some point it left, then she went to bed. But of course, no one believed her about her encounter. Number 2. A teenager was babysitting her younger sister while their parents went out to dinner in the Golden Arvada area. Their parents were due home soon, and so the 2 sisters were watching out the window to see if they could run out and surprise them. Just then, the motion light in the front yard kicked on, and they watched with horror as a werewolf, of all things, stepped out into the yard. It looked right at them and seemed to glide back and forth, almost as if it was on a mechanical track or something. It grinned at them and seemed to enjoy the fear it was provoking in the girls. It didn't approach the window. It just kept walking back and forth while maintaining direct eye contact with them the whole time. Just then, their parents pulled into the driveway, the headlight shining in the window, temporarily blinding the girls. When they looked back, the werewolf was gone. They told their dad when he got in and he went out to take a look, but nothing was there, nor were there any tracks. But you can't typically see much in that dry Colorado grass anyway. Those are 2 stories that I think of from time to time. I find them curious, seeing as how close they occurred, so close to a major metropolitan area. But even for the sprawl, Denver is still just a blip on the map where the Great Plains meet the Rocky Mountains, and there are numerous green belts and creeks and rivers that snake all the way down from the mountains and into the city. As humans continue to expand into wilderness areas, I think we can expect to see more and more encounters of this sort. The Birdman. From Anonymous. Back in 2014, I was looking for a fresh start with my 2 children and newborn baby. We received our first apartment in a shady area of town. It was nice enough to call home. The inside was decent. Our kitchen window faced a playground, which made our new home that much more welcoming. All the bedrooms were located upstairs, where my older 2 children finally had their own rooms across the hall from mine. At the time, it felt like things were really looking up for my family. Unfortunately, this would change. One day we came home to official warning notes that were taped to everyone's doors in our neighborhood, warning of recent local break-ins. My oldest son's behavior towards being in his bedroom at night slowly began to change as well. He seemed to be afraid, but I thought nothing of it at first, as I found this typical for his age. One night I woke up out of the dead of sleep to discover to my horror what has been haunting my son. I heard my daughter scream and a loud crash. I urged my then boyfriend to go with me to see what happened. The crash was so loud, I knew my 2 children couldn't have been behind it. As I clutched my baby in my hands and followed behind my boyfriend, I could see my son frozen in fear in his bed. I glanced at the fan that fell to the ground. Things were not making sense, until the moonlight that shined through the small window above my son's bed revealed a humanoid figure crouched beside his bed. Its head was covered in black feathers. Its eyes glowed red in the dark, like a predator. But its long, twisted, crooked beak that curved was the most disturbing part. It had the body of a human, with small black feathers that ran along the shoulders and arms. Crouched on all fours, it put a single finger to its beak and shushed me. I screamed to my boyfriend, "What is that? Do you see that?" I then grabbed my son with me out of his bed, pulling him close to me and rushing out of the room. I searched for my daughter in her room, and I had trouble finding her at first, but eventually I did. I found her with tears running down her face. We called the police, and they determined no force of entry. There was no trace of this thing that had somehow broke into our home. We had the kids sleep in our room that night. When I discussed this with my then boyfriend, he told me he didn't see anything out of the ordinary that night, just a busted fan on the floor. This event traumatized my oldest son. He told me he thought this creature or person had been his friend. He said it watched him from his closet every night. One night, it was at the end of his bed. He told me he felt paralyzed, even though the thing hadn't touched him. When we first moved in, he got out of the bed and went in the closet with the Birdman creature. The thing didn't even flinch. It just continued to stare at his bed. I couldn't bear to hear any more of this. After all, I'd seen the terror of what he was talking about. But I still believed it was just some intruder in a costume. Perhaps he was making this story up. Maybe he overheard what I saw as I described it to the cops. Or at the very least, it was maybe a hallucination. Given that my now ex didn't see the person or creature, the hallucination explanation seemed likely. That was until my daughter 6 years later remembered this event and finally spoke of it. She told me she had heard the crash too. She opened her brother's door in time to see the Birdman creature emerge from the closet. He crawled and lurched across the floor on all fours behind their little couch. It didn't make eye contact with my daughter. It was then that she screamed as it was heading towards my son's bed, with him still in it. Then my daughter ran off to hide. I entered my son's room soon after. I'm not sure why we all saw this creature, why my then boyfriend didn't, and why it never actually touched us. I'm not even sure if this thing was actually human. Have you ever encountered anything like this? All fun and games. From Chicky Baby. All my life, I grew up playing in the woods. From the time I was a little girl going fishing with my grandfather along the rivers in mid-Michigan, to present day living in Florida. But this story takes place in a growing town in Alabama. I was around 17 years old, and like any high school teen, I was learning about what real freedom was, going and spending the night at friends' houses, and going out to the greenways, which is just a nature walk for soccer moms with a playground at both ends. It was around 11 p.m. and, per usual, my night owl friends and I were bored. We weren't allowed to smoke in the house, or around our parents at all, since living in the Bible Belt and a military town, it was highly looked down on. We were over at a friend's house. For their sake, I'll call them L and M. Per norm, we decided to go on an adventure in the middle of the night. We picked up our other friends, Matt, A, and J. We had the bright idea of going up the nearest mountain, which was at the center of the town with lots of pathways and greenways. Surely nothing could be living that close to human population, right? As we pulled up to the mountain, it seemed extra dark, as rain clouds started to roll in. That didn't stop us, despite the fact that Elle had worn her flip-flops to hike a trail in the dark. Getting out of the car, there wasn't a sound around us, just the crunch of gravel under our shoes. I'd worn boots since I was the iconic goth girl. Em and I had visited the mountain many times before in the daytime. It was a gorgeous place that overlooked the town we lived in. Our destination would be a large boulder stacked on top of other boulders. Once we reached the rock, we each took turns helping one another climb up the rock. We started getting lost in conversation like teens do. Elle and Matt were a couple, and Jay was my boyfriend at the time, and A would be later in life. Em is my best friend and to this day still is. As usual, I pulled out my bag and filled the fancy glassware that I'd brought that day, a pretty little bowl with pinks and yellows, but I ended up dropping it, with a tink, tink, and crash. It had bounced off the rocky formation in front of us and into the darkness of the woods below. After a moment of debating what we should all do now, A wanted to impress the lot, deciding to climb down and trying to fetch the broken pieces. "Maybe it's not completely ruined," A said. I rolled my eyes at that, knowing it very much was. As he climbed down and out of sight, I got this weird feeling, like we weren't actually alone out here. I quickly pushed this to the back of my mind, as the mountain was surrounded by people's homes, so maybe someone was out here. From the dark, we could hear A's footsteps. That alone was kind of creepy until I heard something off. I quickly shushed my friends and listened. Bushes further down were rustling every time my friend A took a step, and it wasn't from him. "You guys hear that?" I asked the group. They each looked at me wide-eyed and nodded. Elle called out to A, "Forget it! Get back up here and let's go!" Again, the bushes moved. A must have heard it too, because his footsteps became more frantic. He hurried to retrace his steps up the steep hill in the dark. Every step he took closer to us, that thing in the dark took another step closer to him. I could hear its footsteps now. They were calm, deliberate, and heavy. I nodded to Jay and M, who got Elle and Matt's attention. We slowly and as quietly as we could began to climb down. That's when the rain began to fall, making the rocks slippery and helping hide the sound of whatever it was out there following my friend right to us. We started walking quietly at first, trying to make very little noise, until A finally caught up to us. He was out of breath and looked terrified. Having been the one to know the path by memory, I began to lead us out of there until I heard the bushes by the rock beginning to move. It was right behind us. I burst out, "Get to the car!" and we took off running. Elle behind me had to go a little slower, but Matt made sure she didn't trip or hurt herself, having chosen poor footwear for the occasion. Thump, thump, thump. Something big was coming after us, which fueled us all forward like we were track stars, until we finally threw ourselves into the car, peeling out, sending rocks flying in all directions. It was a quiet trip down the winding mountain as the group had their eyes on the woods. Being the oldest and the driver, I kept my eyes on the road and ditches. It wasn't until we were surrounded by streetlights and houses that we slowed down, and I finally took a breath. Em looked at me. What the heck was that? A bear? A mountain lion? I shook my head. In the middle of the city? We never did find out what it was that chased us through the dark. One thing is for sure, we never went back to that spot past sundown. Warning: the following story contains mentions of self-harm. The Whistling, from HeyItsEli. I'm around 16 now, but these encounters happened every winter from 2016 to 2020. I'll be sharing my first encounter and the two most scarring ones. The first encounter was on December 17th of 2016. I was 10 years old. It was about 9 p.m. when I was told to take out the trash for my parents, which I begrudgingly agreed to. Once I was at the curb, I felt like I was being watched from every direction. My young mind thought to look around for the thing watching me, but there was nothing, nowhere for it to hide. As I began to return to the front door, I froze. There was this odd whistling noise. It sounded like it was trying to lure me to where it was, but there was something off about this whistling. It didn't sound like something a person could make at all. It sounded otherworldly. My heart began racing, and I ran back inside to immediately tell my parents about this thing outside. My dad stepped outside with a metal baseball bat behind his back, with me hiding behind him as well. He scanned the area with his eyes, then turned back to me and picked me up. "There's nobody out there, and if there was, I'd mash them up with this bat like mashed potatoes." His words made me slightly happier. I giggled a bit. Later, I fell asleep as usual that night. But I woke up at around 2 a.m., and once again, I could hear the sound of that horrible whistling. I was frozen in place for around 15 minutes straight, until it finally stopped. But I waited 5 more minutes until slowly getting up. As soon as I got up, though, there was a tapping on the window right next to my bed. I hid under my covers and cried until it also stopped. When it finally stopped, I bolted into my parents' room. I cried loudly to them that there was something whistling and tapping on my window. After that night, it happened the same way until December 2nd of 2019. I was 13 then, and I forgot completely about the incident. Well, almost. We moved to a new house, meaning there was no window right over my bed. It was roughly 1 a.m. when I snuck out of the house to go hang out and smoke with my girlfriend. When I made it to the park, she was there as we had planned. We talked sweetly to each other and all that stuff, and as we were focused on each other, I heard that darned whistling. She heard it too, making her jump. All those horrifying memories came flooding back as I held her close to me, telling her in a serious tone, "We need to get out of here and to my house, now." We ran as fast as we could back to my house. We climbed through my bedroom window and locked it shut, still hearing that creepy whistling. She stayed at my house that night. I had to admit to my parents that I snuck out with her. They weren't that mad, actually. In the morning, she went back to her house. I walked her over there, of course. The third and final encounter was the worst of all. It was January 1st of 2020. I was 14, and sadly, my girlfriend and I broke up a couple of days after that other encounter. I decided I would stay out of serious relationships for a while. Maybe it would help my mental health, which was rapidly declining after 2 self-harm attempts last year. My feelings after the breakup had made it worse. The house I moved into in 2019 had thick woods on all sides, about 7 miles away from the closest house. I decided to explore the woods, wanting to make a small shelter for practice surviving in the woods. I took my machete with me, and my golden retriever, Maisie. As we walked through the woods, Maisie began to growl aggressively. She hadn't sounded like this before, so it caught me off guard. I tried to calm her down, asking her what's wrong. Curiously, I looked in the direction she was staring. I stopped breathing. The whistling began as soon as I saw the thing. This time it wasn't dark out, so it was fairly easy to make out the figure's appearance. It looked to be 7 to 8 feet tall. It had horns like a ram and looked like a goat, but it was standing on 2 legs with its knees bent backwards and orange, almost glowing eyes. It opened its mouth, but instead of a whistle, it let out a blood-curdling scream. That sound was so gut-wrenching, I almost threw up right there. Terrified, I ran back to my house as quick as I could with Maisie, not looking back until I got back inside. When I did look back, I saw those 2 orange eyes staring at me, but then it ran back into the woods. I was mentally scarred for life that day, and I never went back in those woods again. I attempted to search up what I thought it was, and the only possible thing it could have been was the Goat Man. After reading stories about the Goat Man, I was thankful that I got away from it. I've always wondered what would have happened to me if I'd followed those whistling sounds all those years ago. I hope I never hear it again. Creatures in the Tall Grass, from Butterfly 7. This happened back when I was 13. Every day I had to go to the local park because my brother wanted to go to the skate park. It was pretty boring, so I started inviting one of my friends to go with me. My friend was a shy kid, let's call him G. G and I were never terribly close, but we were stuck together, so we became steadily closer over the years. Now at our local park, there is a big soccer field, and at the edge there is a fence. If you go past this fence, you'll find a big drop-off into a valley. My other friends and I had gone down a few other times, but this time it was just me and G. I had planned to go down and explore more, as I'd started to make a map and wanted to put more on it. G and I slid down the dirt hill. We got down to the bottom, which had a dried-up river, and we began to look around. We joked and jumped on rocks, but I had this sinking feeling of being watched. I ignored it, and we continued our adventure. We walked up the dried riverbed to what I called the Pine Hill, because the whole hill was covered in pine needles. G and I began the climb up. I beat him to the top, being the more athletic one. As I waited for G at the top, I looked around. The place was mostly just pine trees, and they grew really close together, so I couldn't see the bottom on the hill. Then I made a mistake and looked up. I almost screamed when I saw that the branches had bones hanging from them, a few skulls here and there. The bones seemed to be hanging from dried skin. It looked like the remains of cows or pigs. Even so, that didn't stop the fear from flooding in. I covered my mouth and nearly jumped out of my skin when G came up behind me. Not wanting to scare G, I told him we should go back down the hill and back to the park. But G shook his head, saying he wanted to look around more. I tried not to think about what I saw, but it stuck with me as we walked around the hilltop. As we walked in the opposite direction of where we'd come from, I felt more and more uncomfortable. I was prepared to chicken out on G and leave knowing he would leave with me. But then I saw it, a big barbed wire fence. Past it was a field of cane grass. It swayed in the wind. G started to move towards the fence, wanting to go past the fence and into the field, but I stopped him, grabbing his arm. G started to object, but that's when we heard a low growl. The two of us froze. The cane grass on the right began to sway, like something big was walking through it, coming our way. Then we heard this loud screech from behind the thing. The big thing growled in response. My fight-or-flight response to all of this kicked in, and still holding G's arm, I turned and ran. Not long after that, I heard the crashing of branches behind us and a roar of anger, but I ignored all of it. We slid down the hill quickly. Now, something to explain here is that the river curved around this hill, so I thought going straight down would lead us to where we started. But when we reached the bottom, I didn't even recognize where we were. So after I paused for only a moment, I chose a new direction quickly and ran that way. Thankfully, it was a good guess. We soon reached our actual starting point. Never in my life have I climbed a hill so fast. G and I were like monkeys using vines to pull ourselves up faster. When I thought I was safe hiding behind a big tree, I looked down. I wish I hadn't. I saw those two things down at the bottom. The bigger one looked up at me. They were both huge, covered in dark fur. Neither of them had eyes, and the bigger one snarled when it saw me, though I have no idea how it could see at all. And I swear I heard it speak. Leave. I turned and kept climbing. I basically flew over the fence and ran across the soccer field. G was already out and sitting on a bench, catching his breath. We didn't talk about what happened, and I don't think we have since. but every time I go to the park, I get this sinking feeling. And some days when I'm walking around the soccer field, I hear those things growling and screeching in the distance. Something followed me to my friend's house. From Turkle 265. Around 5 years ago, in a tiny town called Oakham in Massachusetts, my ex and my daughter lived on one side of town and my friend on the other. I would watch my daughter while my ex was at work, and since I didn't have a car at the time, I would walk to my friend's house after putting my daughter to bed. It was only about 1.5 miles. It wasn't a bad walk. One day I was taking that walk. I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I shined my flashlight, which I usually keep with me because these walks are always at around 8 p.m. I saw this really big-looking dog, but I didn't think much of it. It didn't seem to reflect any of the light. Like the circle the flashlight beam made was all green grass in this person's driveway, with a big black silhouette in the middle. The road I walk down is just forest on either side, with one streetlight in the whole 1.5-mile walk, with a few houses here and there. And whatever that thing was, it was following me just inside the tree line. Now, whatever that thing was, coyote, someone's pet, or something else, it followed me all the way to my friend's house, and when I got there, my friend's dog began to freak out, throwing himself at the door, trying to get away, making noises closer to a chicken than a dog. Let me tell you, when you're walking in the dark and can clearly hear leaves and sticks crunching just out of your sight, it's pretty darn scary, knowing you're being followed, not knowing what it is. Now for the speculation. What if it was a Wendigo? After all, the thing didn't reflect any light, as if it was unnatural. Also, my friend had been studying them a lot, and perhaps he had attracted one to our neighborhood. Not to mention, later on that night, my friend and I were sitting at his kitchen table, and there was this huge bang on the house wall. We jumped up and looked around, but there wasn't a penny out of place. That's about it. Regardless of whether you want to believe the Wendigo part, the getting followed by something down an unlit road at night part is very true. On another occasion, I was with that same friend doing whatever in his backyard, and we saw a porcupine. No big deal, until the porcupine stood up on its hind legs, turned its whole body to look right at us, turned back, and walked off into the trees on its hind legs like a little person. I'm not kidding. I don't know if that's a thing porcupines do, but it was weird. Thanks for listening. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.